All right, welcome everyone to our fourth webinar in a series of webinars as we enter into our second month, I think on the day, the 14th, of self-isolation. Vehicle miles traveled, a look at mitigation and how it will change the new landscape presented by Jackson Titus. Thank you for that sponsorship. My name is Steve Lamott. I'm the Executive Officer of BIA Orange County. Before we start today, and as I do each time, I want to thank all the attendees who are on the webinar today. I remind our viewers that the BIA is made up of three pillars: advocacy, networking, and education. Without in-person meetings, we rely on these webinars to help fund our advocacy efforts that we engage in every day. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've supported projects remotely. We've assisted members through the city process. We've engaged on inclusionary zoning issues, rent control issues. And recently, with the BIASC, a coalition of our partners and our consultants, one being on this webinar today, have achieved a delay in the RTP SCS vote at the SCAG Regional Council meeting last week. So your membership and your engagement are imperative so the BIA can continue to fight for the industry. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our panel and start with Andy Henderson with the Henderson Law Firm. Andy focuses on land use issues, including environmental law, entitlement, regulatory development issues, and related business formations and transactions. As an environmental litigator and transactional regulatory attorney, Andy has represented clients across a spectrum of interests, from organizations that have him advocate for, whose organizations are affected by environmental regulations, and has also spent about 8.5 years as general counsel for both the BIA and our litigation affiliate, the BUILD Foundation, Building Industry Legal Defense Foundation again. Next, we have Sandy Bachishari, and we're going to call him Sandy today. Sandy is co-founder and principal at Translutions with over 18 years of experience in planning and technical transportation analysis for multidisciplinary infrastructure and land use projects. Since the passage of Senate Bill 375 and Assembly Bill 32, Sandy has been involved in greenhouse gas reduction strategies, including facilitation of transit, complete streets implementation, and vehicle trip reduction strategies, which is now more relevant in terms of transportation impacts under SB 743 and VMT. Lastly, we'll have Tony Petros, principal with LSA. Tony brings over 35 years of experience in transportation planning and mobility. Tony's primary responsibilities include the management and supervision of the transportation function of LSA in California. Has been involved with LSA's long history with Senate Bill 743, specific involvement in other agencies, and vehicle miles traveled threshold. His extensive resume includes quality control and deliverable management for VMT projects with jurisdictions such as Fresno, Long Beach, in the county of Orange, and has led the OCTA 2014 and 2018 long-range transportation plans. So with that, I will ask everyone to please utilize your Q&A feature below. This will be a pretty straightforward discussion, hearing from Andy on the history, first of the industry's opposition to this policy, Sandy's work with local cities and out in the Inland Empire as well. And then we'll end with Tony discussing sort of a general discussion of VMT as well as mitigation measures. I think one of these questions that we've always come across in terms of this policy. So again, this will be much more informative. If you utilize the Q&A feature, please ask as many questions as possible, and then I'll try to get those answered at the end of the panel. And so with that, Andy, I'm going to kick it over to you to start us off.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, there is a long history with the BIA and California Building Industry Association related to vehicle miles traveled. It goes really all the way back to 2006 when Assembly Bill 32 was passed and had goals for greenhouse gas reductions throughout the state, and really gave CARB, the California Air Resources Board, tremendous regulatory power to achieve the greenhouse gas reductions. Shortly after that, in early 2007, they started working on what eventually became SB 375, which was adopted later the next year. And that was a reaction to the fear that the California Air Resources Board would want to get into land use planning as part of its greenhouse gas reduction efforts. So, by the way, I apologize if there's a noise in the background. From time to time, there's going to be a loudspeaker. But responding to the fear that CARB was going to go get into land use, SB 375 started in early 2007, and the very first draft of it had a mandate that larger counties, which would mean pretty much most of the counties in the BIA area, would have to reduce their per capita vehicle miles traveled by 10% across the board. And it's very hard to reduce vehicle miles traveled per capita in a growing population. It's sort of never been done, but that was the initial mandate. We succeeded in getting that thrown out of SB 375, and in its final version, it was aimed strictly at reducing greenhouse gases, not at reducing vehicle miles traveled. But then once it was enacted in 2008, CARB started putting in place rules as to how you would reduce greenhouse gases through your regional transportation planning and your sustainable community strategy. And over time, it basically turned into a sort of scenario planning thing that reduced VMT anyways. We fought that all along, and in reality, SB 375 has little impact on local governments and their ability to shape and reshape from time to time their general plans. So SB 375 was seen as relatively innocuous. However, in 2013, new legislation came along, and it empowered the Secretary of Resources, working with the Office of Planning and Research at the Governor's Office, to consider an alternative to level of service, which is the normal manner by which projects would analyze their traffic impacts. And the argument at the time was that these traffic things were inhibiting downtown redevelopment, and so could they do away with it? And so this legislation came along called Senate Bill 743 that empowered the OPR, the Office of Planning and Research, and the Resources Secretary to look at any and all possibilities to eliminate level of service analysis from CEQA and put something else in its place. That eventually became, what we have now as the fruition of SB 743 is a mandate to do away with LOS under CEQA entirely, although many jurisdictions will continue to do level of service and transportation impact planning as part of their police powers outside of CEQA and as part of their consistency with their general plans. But level of service is getting thrown out of CEQA, and in its place is a VMT mandate, a mandate to consider VMT, which is a basic measure of individual mobility, to be in and of itself an environmental impact under CEQA that has to be mitigated down to insignificance. And this we fought really for many years, from 2013 on, when the legislation came out. We fought with OPR and delayed it for probably 3 or 4 years, and had many comments on this whole concept before the Resources Secretary. And we opposed it every step of the way, and we continue to think it's just absurd policy. And yet it is now the law of California that local governments by July 1st of this year have to have in place an articulation of their threshold of significance for vehicle miles traveled for use under CEQA. So anytime you have a project with a discretionary land use approval, that kicks in potentially CEQA, and you now have this mandate to either fall within an exemption to a vehicle miles traveled imposition, mitigation imposition, or you're going to get one. You're going to get a mandate to mitigate your vehicle miles traveled for a project that's going through CEQA. So BIA has been working hard with the various cities and counties around the region towards this July 1st deadline for the VMT threshold. Once that's in, all the projects that are swept up in CEQA will be either exempt because of they're located next to transit, for example, or they fall below the threshold that's established by the city or county for VMT. If you're not exempt and you don't fall below the threshold, then you not only have to analyze it, but mitigate vehicle miles traveled. We're very concerned about the potential costs to mitigate vehicle miles traveled, because it really has everything to do with the juxtaposition of where you're building homes versus where people work and shop. And there's not a lot you can do to change that other than give up your business model if you're a greenfield or edge developer. So it's going to be quite hard to actually reduce vehicle miles traveled in many projects, and many marginal projects will be hammered by this. That's our view. But we are working closely with the cities and counties to try to get them to establish thresholds that have a lot of exemptions or give some sort of pass, so as to minimize the amount of analysis that has to be done by developers in the first instance, and minimizes the amount of mitigation that needs to be done later on. So I'll be glad to kick it over to these other two gentlemen who really are specialists and have been working hard with the pendency of this coming along, and can better talk about what the actual thresholds are going to be, and what the likely mitigation obligations are going to look like.
Yeah, actually, we'll kick it over to Sandy here in a second. But Andy, if you can hear me over the loudspeaker, I did want to ask you one question while we're kind of on this historical topic, maybe a little bit more on the political and policy ramifications. But what are the social justice issues with this VMT policy? I mean, we're obviously going to try and have a little bit more of a denser plan when it comes to building. And, generally speaking, more affordable homes are built on the periphery, built out in the Inland Empire. And so, is this only going to make housing more affordable or more unattainable in the areas where attainable housing can be built?
Yeah, well, clearly it will. Redevelopment and urban redevelopment and intensified development of that type is far more expensive on a square foot basis than suburban development, and just the cost of that urban development is sky high compared to what many of our members do and have long done well in terms of doing new communities on the edge. So the other thing is that many middle class people not only want to live in a suburban environment, but it's really all they can afford. Is they drive to what they can afford, and that's often Western Riverside County or places like that, where there is available land, but there's naturally going to be a higher level of VMT. Many kinds of workers, like for example, none more than construction workers, naturally drive a long distance to their job sites, which are somewhat nomadic. So this mandate is going to have tremendous impact on the middle class. It's frankly going to have tremendous impact on the people who aspire to the middle class, because there's, what chance do they have other than a government subsidy of getting into expensive urban condominiums or apartments? So it's going to affect all types. It's really poor policy. We want to see some urban redevelopment. We want to see some intensification. We probably also want to see our greenfield development be a little bit smarter than it's been in the past, and that means a little bit more relative density, and certainly being cognizant of job housing balances and transit. So all of it makes sense to think along those lines, but this is an unsustainable policy, and especially if the thresholds are set so that you have to get 15% below average. That, in my view, has even constitutional ramifications for being a disproportionate impact on new development that shouldn't be allowed. But many of the Office of Planning and Research recommends that. So that's problematic. But the reality is this: if you'd said 150 years ago that you could only develop property in California if you reduce horse miles ridden by 15%. There would never have been a California developed anything like it is now. It's not a sustainable policy, and my prediction is they'll have to give this up in the long run. The other thing is, this is all being done in the name of greenhouse gas reduction, and the practical reality is that fleet and fuel change is far superior and far quicker way to reduce greenhouse gas than the monkeying around this way with land use and stopping the sort of organic way in which land use generally unfolds, you know, with millions of people making decisions as to what they think is best for them. So anyways, that's my long rant on the
No,
policies.
perfect. I appreciate that. Well, thank you, Andy, for that. Now I guess we're going to kick it over to Sandy, who has been working for quite a while, actually implementing this policy, I guess, with cities. Andy, Sandy, a lot of cities in the Inland Empire, a lot of cities in general have been trying to get this policy implemented, obviously by the deadline, and some have been doing it by themselves, and some have been doing it quite early, if I'm not mistaken. So, going to kick it over to you. I'd love to hear again what you have to say on this. And you are muted, Sandy. I don't know. I can unmute you. Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
I got you. Perfect.
Perfect. So yeah, I'll start off with something that Andy said is that the purpose of SB 743, the stated purpose, was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And during SB 375 and AB 32, they realized that reducing VMT, which again is the primary indicator of how much emissions are going to happen, if we discount the rapid changes in vehicle technology, they realize that it's not feasible to reduce VMT as much as you would want to be. Yes, 40% of the emissions roughly come from transportation, but reducing that is difficult without changes in transportation or vehicle technology, or building a ton of transit, which again we all want transit to be built so that somebody else can use it. So with SB 743 and greenhouse gas reductions, even if, let's say, there's an apartment developer which ties in the lease to a Nissan Leaf or some other electric vehicle, which essentially the mobile source GHG emissions are reduced to zero, that is not going to have any impact in mitigating the VMT thresholds under 743. It'll help in the GHG analysis, it'll help in air quality, but not on transportation. So even doing that would result in could result in a significant impact under transportation. Now, I think Tony will go into greater detail on these, but the primary focus of all the guidelines that we have been helping cities with has been, okay, we need to figure out when a VMT analysis is actually needed. So small projects are not, could be exempt. Project location, for example, if you're near a high quality transit area, a transit priority area, or a low VMT generating area, you potentially don't have to do a VMT analysis. Then if you're locally serving use, like a school or a small fast food type use, you don't have to do that analysis. Now, the biggest issue that we are running into is how do we determine the project size? So the OPR, as part of their technical advisory, has said that any project with less than 110 daily trips could be considered small enough that it would not have an impact. Now, 110 daily trips is about 11 single-family homes. Most jurisdictions in the Inland Empire now do not require traffic studies for about 50 single-family homes. So 50 peak hour trips is what they use as a threshold. And that too, you only have to do a very focused analysis. Now imagine that's going to get reduced to about 11 houses. So anything larger than 11 houses, when you do a VMT analysis, and if you don't fall into any of those categories mentioned earlier, there's a very high chance that you would have an impact. And Tony will go into greater detail on the mitigation measures, but honestly, for a small project, there's not much that you could do to mitigate your impacts. So what we have been trying to do with the BIA is work on strategies and work with the cities to potentially increase the 110 trip threshold that the OPR has recommended, and a lot of cities have actually adopted. City of Irvine, City of LA, San Diego, and the Santec, Sandag, ITE recommendations are significantly higher. LA is going with a threshold of 250 trips. Irvine, I believe, is going with 250, and San Diego, City of San Diego is going with 300 trips. What Santec ITE panel is recommending for Sandag is to go with 1,000 trips if you're consistent with the general plan, and 500 trips if you're not consistent with the general plan. Again, the 500 trips equates to roughly 50 homes, so that's a decent number to use as a threshold. Now, if a VMT analysis is needed, the OPR said that you would have a less than significant impact if your project's VMT is no greater than 15% below the existing city or regional VMT. So it's the wording is a little confusing. So essentially what it means is if your project's VMT is greater than 85% of the city or regional VMT, then you have an impact. Now again, I'd like to remind everybody that these are just recommendations. It's not in the legislation. It's not in the CEQA guidelines themselves. So every jurisdiction has the ability to change these or to adopt different thresholds. In San Bernardino County, specifically the County of San Bernardino, instead of using that 15% below threshold, they are using 4% below threshold. Many jurisdictions in the Inland Empire have said that, okay, you would not have a significant impact if you are, as long as your VMT is no greater than the existing or general plan VMT for the city or the region. In the Inland Empire, WRCOG for Riverside County and SBCTA for San Bernardino County are taking the primary lead. And SBCTA has developed a checklist for use by different cities, and we are helping a few cities with in coming up with their thresholds. The one other thing that, again, Tony will go into more detail is, like I mentioned earlier, because you have the ability as a city, you know, and as an industry, we should encourage cities to develop thresholds which are, you know, more conducive and helpful to development projects, because again, if you cannot mitigate your impacts, you get kicked into an EIR, and that comes with added cost, added time, and has implications on how affordable housing is. So with that, again, if there's any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. Yeah, so, you know, we actually talked about this question, sort of something I brought up. I don't know if it's well known or not, but I thought you had a pretty good response on our discussion the other day. But we could possibly be moving towards a much more significant work from home scenario. And, I thought your response was great. It doesn't sound like a work from home scenario is going to affect this policy anytime soon. And so I don't know if you could just spend a second on kind of what you explained to me in terms of, again, moving toward this work from home scenario and if it will affect this policy.
Yes, so once the policies are set, again, by the time we figure out how the work from home is going to, change commutes, change travel patterns and all that, it'll be a while. Yeah. That said, I just found out there's this huge tech company in India which employs over 1 million people. They have what they figured, again, traffic in India is much crazier than traffic here, and it takes forever to go from one place to another during peak hours especially. So this company has figured out that people are more efficient when they're working from home. And they have stated that they're going to get out of their office space leases on 75% of their existing leases. And they have advised employees that they should not come into the office any more than 2 times a week. So yeah, it has implications. And again, one way to look at it is, we probably will hit our 2030 GHG targets this year. I say that in jest, but again, from a CEQA perspective, depending on how an agency adopts its thresholds, because the guidelines say 15% or whatever you adopt below existing VMT. So when everybody is working from home and the data shows that the actual VMT has decreased, is new development going to be required to reduce it even further? Wow. That is the big unknown, and that has other implications beyond what we are thinking at this time.
Okay, wow, very interesting. I appreciate that response. And again, to everybody watching, we've gotten a couple questions over the Q&A feature. Please don't forget to ask some questions so we can, get to those after the panel. We're going to go over to Tony, and Tony, you're going to talk about a little bit of, general discussion, but mainly mitigation, I think. And if, I'm definitely no expert on VMT, but every time I'm at a VMT meeting or discussion, it's always what are the mitigation measures that, our industry can do to qualify under this policy. So kick it over to you, Tony.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And before I begin my remarks, I do want to thank Steve and Laura and the BIA for one very specific purpose. This is the first time that I can recollect in a number of weeks that I'm out of my pajamas and I have a collared shirt on. In fact, I am wearing long pants for this. So Steve, thank you so very much. Thank you for allowing me to be with you today. I've been with you for a number of these 743 discussions, and many of those discussions have been us bemoaning the impact of 743. I still think it is a misguided policy initiative. We don't have to go into that. Unfortunately, it is the law. So how do we operate in a post-743 world? There are three primary documents that we look at. One is CEQA itself, the law. The second are the CEQA guidelines, which also have the weight of law behind them. And then there are these technical advisories that the Office of Planning and Research has created. They do not have the weight of law. They are an advisory. There is no greater chasm in my recollection between the law and an advisory than what is provided for as it relates to 743. In fact, when you look at what the guidelines say about land projects, it simply says, and this is the law, vehicle miles traveled exceeding an applicable threshold of significance may indicate a significant impact. That's your guidance from a legal standpoint. An applicable threshold of significance may indicate a significant impact. What the technical advisory speaks to, though, are three, well, let's call it, three primary areas. One, there are conditions where a project may be screened out. It doesn't rise to the occasion to be considered to have created a significant impact, and therefore can be screened out. Sandy mentioned the notion of daily trip thresholds. Then you would move on to its location. If a project is located within an area that has low vehicle miles traveled itself, you can generally assume that you, if you're similar to that, would also have a low VMT profile, and that would be your demonstration of an impact. If you are not in either one of those cases, a screening out condition or a low VMT area, then you have to move on to a more rigorous VMT analysis. And that's where this 85% of existing recommendation from an advisory comes in. Now, Sandy has mentioned that San Bernardino County, it has recommended a threshold of 4%. There are, I believe, one or two other agencies that I'm aware of that have gone something different than the 85%. We happen to be working in the Central Valley, and at this point, the Fresno COG area is recommending 87% of existing. Why? Because they have approval from CARB, from their RTP, that they can achieve only 13% reduction in greenhouse gases. So what we're trying to demonstrate, and this is where you would want to work with agencies to say, hey, look, agency, you already told CARB you can only achieve so much greenhouse gas. Why should you be held to anything higher or greater than what you already have approval for from the state agencies? So that's where, at least in the Fresno area, we were able to achieve something different than the 85%. Having said that, unfortunately, most of the other agencies in the state are going with that 85%. So that is something that, at least in the initial foray into 743, post July 1, you as the development community will look forward to. But let's take a look a little bit more at the screening question. And Laura, if I could trouble you to, oh, I'm sorry. There is a process, and we have put together a flow chart, and I believe this is available to all the participants in the webinar, where there is, as I mentioned, a screening process, then the identification of the project VMT. VMT is simply the number of trips multiplied by the distance those trips will travel. Both of those elements are provided for in our base analysis materials. So those are simple metrics that we can arrive at. That comparison then, or that VMT is compared to thresholds of significance. And that's what you see in the second blue field there. There might be the need to do modeling if or not you're greater than a threshold. And if you still exceed a general threshold, then you're on to mitigation. This is a very detailed flow chart. I offer it to the BIA members here to review. Please contact me if you have any questions on this. But I do want to go to this question of thresholds. And one of those is, and I believe Andy pointed this out, proximity to transit. And if we can go, Laura, to that first figure that I have, here is the definitions of transit proximity in the central part of Orange County. And you can see that for most of the central part of Orange County, land development projects would be seemingly screened out from further analysis. In fact, in the city of Santa Ana's guidelines, they come to the conclusion that, heck, most of Santa Ana will not have to do detailed VMT analyses because of the proximity and enriched transit network within that community. I don't know how many of you are following the Last Dance. It's the only good sporting television that we have right now. But in it, the story of Michael Jordan, you know, you hear about be like Mike. Well, I think that for the development community and your acquisitions team, that might be your mantra. Be like Mike, or really be like transit. Your acquisition teams are probably going to be more involved and invested in citing development opportunities around these transit nodes so that you can take advantage of those screening opportunities. And these maps are available throughout the Southland. Some are richer than others. If you look at the next map, Laura, you'll find that in the South County area, it's not as rich because of the Transit 360 efforts and the retreat of some of the fixed route bus service. South County really only has the Metrolink nodes as transit priority areas to develop around without any VMT requirements. The other opportunity that Sandy spoke to was the trip threshold. And part of our work, and LSA is involved in about 25 different agencies around the state providing threshold documentation for them. We actually have done some greenhouse gas modeling and have found that by going as high as 500 ADT, there is substantial evidence that you do not generate greenhouse gas emissions to a level that would cause a significant greenhouse gas impact. So we are providing substantial evidence in our documentation that leads our agencies to go as high as 500. And we could even go higher than that if the agency had the wherewithal to entertain a threshold like that. But screening is probably the most important element of this for the development community to take advantage of. We are also working with a consortium out of Chicago that is using GIS tools to do land acquisition surveys and say within a perimeter related to either transit or bus service or VMT, what are the development opportunities on a parcel by parcel basis? If you have any questions about that type of tool, please, again, look me up. We have that capability to do due diligence and acquisition work for that type of efforts. Let's talk a little bit, and I want to keep moving here, about mitigation. Sandy is correct, and Andy are correct. It will be exceedingly difficult to mitigate VMT impacts on a project by project basis. And let's talk about why. If I have a hole to dig out of that's 15% deep, well, clearly every project is going to add VMT to it. So not only am I going to have 15% that I have to offset by my project design or some attribute, some locational specificity, but I'm going to have the measurable increase in VMT on top of that. So my VMT impact may look something more like 18%, 20%, or something greater than that I'll have to scale back. Well, when we look at traditional VMT strategies, reduction strategies, they may have a reduction benefit of 1%, 2%, and 3%. Not many VMT reduction strategies have double-digit benefit. They just simply do not, based on the data that's out there. Mitigation also must be provided for in perpetuity. If I put in a turn lane to provide congestion relief, you can guarantee that that turn lane will be there as long as the concrete exists, and it will behave in a manner that provides for the capacity on an observable and expected basis. However, if I provide for a bike share in my apartment complex, one, I don't know if those bikes are going to be there in a week, in a month, in a year. So I will have to make a continuous investment to make sure that it's available. We had done some endowment planning for Cal BIA and found that something as simple as a $50,000 to $100,000 bike share becomes a $4 million endowment investment. That's something to really think about. And furthermore, many of these strategies are behavioral attributes. Not only do I have to put that bike share in, but I have to guarantee that people will ride them and ride them for each and every one of their commute trips. So you can see that it's a little bit stickier here in terms of the efficacy and feasibility of mitigation. I have provided you with a set of very, very detailed matrices. There's over 100 strategies that LSA has researched and provided for you to look at for mitigation strategies for land development projects. These primarily come from the CAPCOA manual, from research conducted by CARB, by research conducted by Susan Handy and Marlon Bornett, both good friends. But I wanted you to have at your disposal the universe of possible strategies. When we present these to our clients, many of our clients will cull them and say, there's a number of these strategies that just aren't applicable to our agency. But please remember, it is left to the EIR preparer to make that recommendation of what constitutes mitigation. The agency has to accept it, but it's left to the EIR preparer to make that suggestion. So I would encourage you, use the matrices that we have provided, at least as a talking point and strategy within your own teams to create effective mitigation. I will end with this because we want to leave some time for questions. Because of that difficulty in project level mitigation, what we're seeing is a opening of a discussion for other features such as mitigation banks and mitigation exchanges related to these types of regional fixes, transit, enriched transit service, completion of sidewalks and bikeways and those types of facilities. Most notably, again, in the Central Valley, because of the spread of development and within the valley, they really are starting to see the value of investigating these exchanges and banks. There is a document that has been prepared by the University of California, Berkeley Law Center that profiles a lot of those exchange and bank mechanisms. The primary issue there is not so much nexus as it is additionality. Again, we don't have the time to go into it in great detail, but if you do have a desire to talk about that more, I'd love to engage in that. Please seek me out. Steve, I'll return it to you and we can entertain some questions or comments.
Thank you. We do have a couple questions from the audience, and then I've compiled a couple in general. But first, I wanted to see any Andy or Sandy, Tony, do you guys have any questions for each other just from what we've discussed? You know, I'd generally like to hear from the experts.
I wanted to talk about the notion of the post-COVID world, because the County of Orange is one of our clients, and we just had this conversation at 9 o'clock this morning, speaking with their legal staff. yes, 743 says that, not 743, caught myself. The technical advisory does recommend a threshold that says it's 85% of existing. And existing could be construed as a rolling average, whatever is existing at that time. And therefore there is the threat that existing could be eroded based upon whatever the conditions are at that time. My argument is this: the California Air Resources Board back in January put out a paper that, based upon their clean fuels alternative, said that in a pre-COVID world, in order to achieve the executive orders and the SB 50 and SB 32 thresholds, in a pre-COVID world, we needed a 15% VMT reduction, not in a post-COVID world. The level of VMT that we were experiencing prior to this pandemic needed a 15% reduction. Therefore, I would argue, and I'm trying to talk to people like California Transportation Commissioner Lucy Dunn and some of our legislative delegation in Sacramento, that if in fact that's what we need to do, maybe we don't need this draconian policy initiative, but instead allow the market forces to react to this pandemic. And if existing businesses were able to say that they would have telecommuting 1 day out of 5, that's a 20% reduction. So it would take a legislative action. It would take a reasoned set of minds, not something we have experienced much in our state capital. But I believe that that is the type of argument that needs to be presented to our legislators. Let the market dictate it, as it's doing right now during these very different times. I'll get off the soapbox.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Andy, any questions really quick before I ask some of the audience questions or any comments?
There's someone talking in the background, so I'll jump on in a second. Maybe go to Sandy first.
Sandy, anything?
So one other thing in terms of the COVID situation to keep in mind is, there are several large employers in the U.S. Who have advised employees not to use transit and not to carpool, which, and again, if you look at the maps, a lot of the transit, extensive transit use there's a strong correlation between being stuck in a subway car where you are like 6 inches away from the next guy is common, and in those areas, that's, you're seeing a large number of cases and spread of COVID. So the employers are not completely crazy in making those recommendations. So what does that do to mitigation measures, even if you are willing to spend a few $1 billion to build a transit line?
I want to, this is Andy, I want to turn the conversation back just for a second to the July 1st deadline for the local governments to exercise their discretion in setting thresholds. There are some jurisdictions like the city of Corona, that was the first one I understood, that did not go 15% below their existing average, but just said it's enough if you meet that if you meet that average and don't have to go below it. We talked about County of San Bernardino is looking for a 4% reduction from just unincorporated area residents, which is again far less heavy-handed than what OPR has recommended in their technical guidance. And so we are working with the cities now. Many of the cities in San Bernardino County, for example, are still in the process of adopting. They've got about 6 weeks to get it done. And we are taking every opportunity to talk with their staff and their planning staffs and figure out ways to educate them about what substantial evidence is out there that could justify them giving our industry a lighter touch than might otherwise be the case. And that's really, as has been talked about all, by everyone, the mitigation burdens are going to be so great, almost unimaginably great, that we, let's focus on this July 1st deadline, do everything we can as an association to work with the cities to try to lighten that load going forward.
Okay, so then that's a good segue into my question that I've actually had a couple people ask here, but what are the odds of a delay in the deadline due to the COVID crisis? Tony, I know you answered someone on the Q&A portion. I think we had somebody else ask it as well.
Yeah.
I mean, what are the odds? What,
highly
maybe
unlikely.
explain what you just typed in.
Highly unlikely. As recently as Monday, Ellen Greenberg, the Director of Sustainability for Caltrans, and Jenny Lee, the Chief Counsel for OPR, both said that the date for the implementation is legislatively fixed. They do not have the discretion to change it. They believe that that agencies have had 6 years to make this adjustment from when the document was, or the law was originally passed in 2013 to now. Furthermore, that the recent 4th District Appellate case in Sacramento that ruled out the use of delay and level of service or redefined the elimination of delay and level of service as a CEQA metric means that can't be relied on any longer. Therefore, Caltrans and OPR and Natural Resources are still sticking to the July 1st date. And this was as recent as Monday.
And I just want to, this is Andy, I just want to add that it's kind of hypocritical because clearly the government code gives the governor sweeping powers in an emergency to delay deadlines. This is why our income taxes aren't due, things like that.
Right.
The governor, if he wanted to, could wave a wand and delay this, but he's not willing to do so.
And keep us off our beaches.
And it's saying my internet's a little unstable. So just some questions. I don't think these were answered, but somewhat a little bit more on the technical side from some of the developer and builder members. But how do parking requirements impact total VMT? Parking is a fertility drug for vehicles. Would reduce parking a potential mitigation to reduce VMT? And I'll kick it over to anybody who can answer that.
In the screening criteria that have been recommended by the OPR, there is a provision around, again, always around a transit area, that limited parking would be seen as a desirable attribute to screen you out. But just it on its own in a suburban setting or in not related to transit really doesn't speak to any of the screening criteria, nor does it really speak to, it could be seen as a project design feature. You could go to CAPCOA and measure the % reduction and program that in. Parking is no longer a CEQA impact as well. So you don't run the risk of creating a CEQA impact. You may anger the community development director, but that's a whole nother question.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, a question from Maria. Is there some method to compare VMT to LOS? Asking about a general plan amendment to add units to a previously entitled project which was studied using going once, going twice.
They're really, there's The inputs to both level of service and VMT are similar. It's the trips generated by your project and then analyzed either for its effect on congestion by the additive nature of that traffic, or the distance it travels by taking that number of trips and applying a distance to it. But to suggest that the metrics have some type of similar outcome or consequence, no. Level of service is very site specific. It is path specific. VMT is not at all locationally specific. It is simply a distance metric. And the one thing that so there really isn't a lot of similarity or causality between the two. The one thing for the development community that I would caution, again, I'm talking to the acquisitions group. If you're looking at properties that abut roadways that have not yet been developed to their ultimate rights of way, be careful. In that case, you could be subject to a infinite do loop that looks like this, and I'll try and be brief because we want to get out of here at 1. You go in, you do your VMT analysis, the land development project by different circumstances itself has no VMT impact, but you're conditioned to widen the road out in front of your property. That road widening happens to be for a distance of a half a mile. Let's say it's a standard, track map block, plat block. That in and of itself, by virtue of the induced growth attributable to lane miles added, could in all likelihood become a VMT impact. So while your land development project does not have a VMT impact, the action of a general plan consistency finding in order to get your circulation element through does. And now you just bought a VMT impact, an EIR, and quite possibly a statement of overriding considerations. So
yeah. Another point I want to make is, I think I mentioned it earlier, every jurisdiction we've talked to about the threshold setting that's now going on and will end on July 1st, every single one has said they're going to keep LOS.
yes.
And it's not going to be in CEQA, so you're going to have your CEQA application, but right alongside it, you're going to have your traffic delay study and mitigation obligations. It's just not going to be called CEQA any longer. So different statutes of limitations, different process of people trying to challenge it, but none of that goes away in terms of the substance of LOS mitigation.
And then if I could add to what Tony said, when you're acquiring land, again, the VMT is calculated based on the traffic models. And, we have seen locations where the north side of a street has a lower VMT than the south side of the street, depending on which traffic analysis zone you fall in. So so that's the crazy thing with VMT is, again, if you're on one side of the street, you might have a less than significant impact, and on the other, you might have a significant impact, which makes no sense in a LOS world.
Well, I appreciate that, gentlemen. We are here at 1 o'clock, and I'm here. My internet is getting a little funky, but with that, I want to thank Andy, Sandy, Tony. Thank you for everything. We are going to try and send out, I believe, the slides that Tony had to those who have registered for the event today. Thank you again to Jackson Titus for sponsoring. And with that, I wish everyone a great day and a great weekend. Thank you.